So hello, my name is Brinkley Messick. I'm a professor in the departments of anthropology and Mises, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies. And I was a founding faculty member in the Center for Palestine Studies at Columbia. This is our session, which we call Readings in the Khalidiyya. And the Khalidiyya Library, located in Jerusalem, is one of the most important manuscript collections in Palestine, and one of the most significant family-owned Islamic manuscript collections in the world. The library's collection has recently been digitized and made available to scholars by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, HMML. This enhanced accessibility of the collection to users around the world is opening new avenues for the study of the history and the intellectual life of Palestine and the wider region. Readings in the Khalidiyya is a project of the Center for Palestine Studies, which is now in its 11th year. If you'd like to know what CPS has been up to over these years, please see our 10-year report on the website under resources. Today's event is co-presented with the Khalidiyya Library itself. Readings is also co-sponsored by the Columbia Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, or CSMS, which has its own website. CPS has been supported in this project by talented librarians, Kaukeb Chabaro and Peter Majersky at Columbia, and Guy Burak at NYU, who is with us as a participant today. Both Columbia and NYU libraries are co-sponsors for today's readings session. The Readings Project focuses on the newly accessible Khalidiyya collection through conversations with scholars involved in manuscript studies. Recordings of previous sessions are available on the CPS website under Programming Jerusalem. For information about the Khalidiyya Library, you can visit the library's excellent updated website. As for the digitized text, these are to be found on the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library website, HMML website. Today's session is the second in the second year of our Readings Project. Our two speakers today are jointly addressing what they title as, quote, Ottoman Librarians and their Metadata. Our colleague Tunç Şen is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Columbia University. He is a historian of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey, whose research revolves around questions about the history of science and divination, history of mentalities and time, history of books, manuscripts, and their readers, and social history of scholarship and education. His first book project, based upon his award-winning dissertation and tentatively titled, quote, The Masters of Time, Astrologers and Scientific Expertise at the Early Modern Ottoman Court. And he examined, this study examines the role and scientific authority of stargazers in measuring, displaying, and interpreting time, ranging from chronological dating to the designation of precise auspicious moments. Tunç co-chairs the Columbia University Ottoman and Turkish Studies seminars and sits on the advisory board for the Manuscripts of the Muslim World Project at Columbia. Of particular relevance for today's discussion is his article this year in Studia Islamica. The title is The Sultan's Syllabus Revisited, 16th Century Ottoman Madrasa Libraries and the Question of Canonization. Joining Tunç is our friend Guy Burak, who is the librarian for Middle Eastern, Islamic, and Jewish Studies at Elmer Holmes Bobst Library at NYU. A leading Ottomanist, Guy is the author of The Second Formation of Islamic Law, the Hanafi School in the Early Modern Ottoman Empire, Cambridge Studies in Islamic Civilization, 2015. Among his many articles and chapters, a number are relevant to today's session. For example, Dynasty Law and the Imperial Provincial Madrasa, the case of Madrasa al-Uthmaniyya in Ottoman Jerusalem, which was published in Ijmes in 2013. Another one is Collating the Signs of Benevolent Deeds, Muhammad Mahdi's Al-Fasi's commentary on Muhammad al-Jazuli's Dala'il al-Khairat and its Ottoman readers. This appeared in 2019 in Philological Encounters. And very close to this particular program, The Pasha and His Librarian, a reading in the inventory of endowed books to the library, of Ahmad Pasha al-Jazzar, who died in 1804 in Akka. This is going to be published in a Festschrift for Andras Riedermeier. So thank you both for joining us. This is really a wonderful panel, I mean, of expertise. And I understand you've organized among yourselves how you want to present. And just I'll tell the audience that they should, and to communicate with us and to ask questions, etc., to use the Q&A function. And after the two presentations, we will begin to look at those Q&As and look at some of the possible comments they might have, the panelists might have. Anyway, thank you all, and off you go. Who's going at Tunch?
I'll be the first. Yeah, Brink.
Please.
Well, thank you so much, Brink, for your generous introduction. It's so great to be here and to share the floor with you and with Guy, whose scholarship I greatly admire. I have a few slides to share, so let me share my screen. I assume all of our participants could now see my PowerPoint, right? Okay. So as Brink has just said, we are going to have a joint presentation, but in fact, we will have two separate presentations on a topic of our shared interest, which is the pre-modern book catalogs and inventories from the Ottoman and the broader Islamic world. The past few years actually have witnessed to a growing interest in the topic, and excellent monographs, edited volumes, and separate articles have been published, including Konrad Hirschler's two most recent monographs, one on the Ashrafiyya inventory from the 13th century and another on Ibn Abd al-Badi's book collection. We should also mention the edited volume by Gülru Necipoğlu, Cemal Kafadar, and Cornel Fleischer on the Ottoman Palace Library inventory prepared in the early 16th century. And Guy and I also have contributed to this volume. And we shouldn't, of course, forget the contributions made by Turkish scholars, the indefatigable Ismail Erunsal, one of the pioneering figures of libraries, book collections, catalogs, and librarians, published extensively on the topic. And I should also mention this Turkish edited volume on an 18th century Ottoman scholar, Jarullah Efendi's library and the collection of books. So what I'll be presenting today are the preliminary results of an ongoing study that my dear friend and colleague Abdurrahman Akçıl and I have been conducting about two surviving book inventories prepared in the 16th century. These two inventories list all the books located at the Fatih Mosque complex in Istanbul that the professors and the students had easy access to. In terms of the metadata and the detailed codicological information these inventories present about each and every item listed in these catalogs, these inventories are treasures of troves to penetrate the intellectual and material universe of the scholarly culture in the 16th century Ottoman world. So as you see here on the slide, there are two surviving inventories at hand. The latter of these, you see on the right-hand side, was completed on January the 9th, 1561 by an instructor named Hacı Hasanzade, who was teaching at the time in the Fatih Semaniye colleges, about which I'll be talking in a minute. The latter of these two inventories was completed by this Haji Hassan Zadeh. Apparently, when he was teaching in the madrasa, he was hired to inspect all the volumes in the collection. And he has an Arabic preamble, as you can see here, to this 87 folio long document. And in this preamble, Haji Hassan Zadeh refers to previous cataloging efforts exerted by his predecessors. So according to this preamble, after Mehmet II, the Ottoman Sultan, established his Grand Mosque complex in the 1460s and donated numerous books to the people at the Sahn schools, the madrasas. Several other dignitaries and leading scholars at the time also endowed several volumes to this great collection from their personal libraries. So officials were commissioned at different times in order to inspect all the items in the collection and prepare or sometimes revise the available catalogs. Up until the time of Haji Hassan Zadeh in 1561, there were two other inventories prepared, but unfortunately only one of the earlier inventories is available at hand, and this inventory is the one compiled by Muhammad bin Ali al-Fanari that you see on the left-hand side. This inventory, there isn't a definitive date for the inventory, but based on the years Muhammad Ali al-Fanari lived and based on some references to Sultan Bayezid II, it should be compiled sometime around 1490s or early 1500s. And the inventory, the earliest inventory in our hand lists more than 1,200 volumes in total that come to us from different donations. The biggest one is the Sultan Mehmet II's endowment that includes almost 800 items. Okay. I will come to the contents and the significance of these inventories, and I'll give some examples about how each and every entry in these inventories gives very precise codicological information about each and every volume. So I'll talk about the contents and the significance in a minute, but let me give you a very brief historical context as to the establishment of this Fatih Mosque complex and the formation of the book collections therein. So following the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Mehmet II had an ambitious urban program to turn Constantinople into the capital of his empire. The construction of the Topkapı Palace, the Grand Bazaar, ordering his statesmen to establish new neighborhoods with new mosques, was crowned by the construction of this mosque complex that was completed in 1470. This complex consisted of a mosque, a hospice, a hospital, bazaar, 8 madrasas, colleges of higher education, which came to be known as Sahn, and another 8 preparatory schools. So here you can see a view of the Fatih Mosque complex, flanked in both by 8 madrasas of higher education, supplemented by 8 preparatory schools. And the Sahn school, these 8 madrasas, operated for many decades as the flagship institution of the higher education in the centralizing empire. And from this early 1470s onwards, we have endowment deeds, the waqfiyas of the complex, where one could find information about the book collections and the librarians. So the earliest endowment deed is dated 1473, and in that waqfiyya are mentioned the names of, not the name, but the position for librarians who are donated to Mehmet II or of the madrasa. These book lists were appended to this waqfiyya, but they only give information about the titles and sometimes the authors of the works, if the author was a famed one. But these book titles do not provide us with detailed physical and codicological description of the items. From the 1480s onwards, these books located in those 4 madrasa libraries were gathered and located on the west side of the mosque. And another chief librarian was hired together with a clerk. And the waqfiyya we have available from the 16th century actually refers to the qualifications and the responsibilities of the librarian and the clerk who would take care of all the books located in the west part of the mosque. So the librarian should be well informed. I put here, I'm sorry, the Turkish original, but in the bottom you can see the rough English translation saying that the librarian should be well informed all the book titles and the contents of each and every item. He would be paid 6 aspers a day, and the clerk should assist him again to keep records of the numbers and the names of the books, as well as the patrons to whom these books were lended. So what we have here is a lending library. So it was primarily for the use of the madrasa instructors and the students, but there are cases that books were also borrowed from people outside. Okay, so let me talk now about what kind of information do these inventories, the earliest of which was compiled in early 16th century, present to us. So each entry, you may also figure out from the items listed in that particular entry, provides information about first the title of the work, okay, the author of that particular work. If the copyist of the text is available, then this is also designated in the entry. It gives an information about the total number of the folios. Entries also give information about the beginnings and the ends of the text, and if there is any missing part in the text compared to earlier inventories or catalogs available in the library, then these missing parts are also duly noted by the cataloger. If the text has some collation remarks or some specific colophons, these are also designated in these entries. And most importantly, maybe entries provide information about the calligraphic and material qualities of each and every item, including the type of script, the color of ink, if there is any decoration or not, if there are charts or tables, what the paper quality or type of paper was, and the binding. So all these incredibly rich and precise information about the textual and material aspects of the volume could help us reconstruct the library today based on the catalog. And I'm going to show you examples here how you can match what each and every entry corresponds to the manuscripts available today, mostly located in the Fatih collection of the Süleymaniye Library. So here for instance, there is an entry on Jami al-Asrar fi Sharh al-Manar, and there is a precise information on the type of paper. It's from Damascus. The type of the type of the binding called jigeri. I'm not so sure what to understand from this word, whether it refers to the color or something else, the total number of folios, etc. But there is also an additional remark about the very end of the text. So there's apparently certain tables regarding the question of divorce. Okay, so this is a book about jurisprudence, and apparently there is a table at the very end of the text noted by the entry, and the same entry is also available in the later inventory, the 1561 inventory. The wording is a little bit different, but the information it provides is more or less the same. And you can find actually the surviving copy today, Jami al-Asrar fi Sharh al-Manar. You can find here the note by the cataloger or the librarian, Muhammad bin Ali al-Fanari, as you can see here. And the total number of folios, again, matching exactly with the entry. Apparently, I forgot to add the final page of the manuscript where those tables are located. But let me move to another example, an entry on, a book titled Mufid al-Hukam, and only certain parts of the book is available apparently as far as the librarian's note is concerned. And it says that on its first page is written in large font, al-Juz al-Thani min al-Mufid al-Hukam fima ya'rudu lahum min nawazil. Again, it provides information about the type of paper, the type of or the color of the binding, and the total number of folios. And the same information is repeated in the later category. And here you can have an idea what the cataloger really means by large fonts written in red. Unfortunately, the copy is Xerox on black and white, so you can't maybe clearly see the red font, but this one is apparently written in big font with red ink. And again, you can find here the signature of the first librarian, Muhammad bin Ali al-Fanari, with a note on the Sultanic endowment. Here you can see the Sultani endowment remark. And again, the same Waqf remark is located on several folios of this manuscript, now available in the Fatih collection. Okay. So the examples could be multiplied. Again, we are now collecting these examples together with Abdurrahman Akçıl, and the idea is to reconstruct based on the surviving manuscripts and the matching records in the entries, the library catalog of Fatih Mosque complex in the 16th century. And here, this example, for instance, gives information about the colophon of the text. The entry refers to the colophon available in the text, and that helps us find and identify as accurately as possible which manuscript is in question here. And this is the Fatih MS 211 Kitab al-Muhit. Again, you can find on the fly leaves the signature of the first cataloger, the librarian. And at the very end of the text, you can find the colophon mentioned in the entry. And as I mentioned, different donations were clustered in these inventories. So it's not just the donation made by Sultan Mehmet II, but also some other statesmen and leading scholars, including the stellar names of the 15th century, like Musannifek or Khatibzadeh. You can find the books donated by these figures, and you can trace these items in the library collections today. And here there is a book, there is an entry on a book donated by a guy named Alayil Muhyiddin, and you can again identify which manuscript is at stake at that particular entry. Again, you see here the Waqfa Alayil Muhyiddin with a signature by the librarian Muhammad bin Ali al-Fanari. So let me stop sharing my screen. I think I am talked longer than I was supposed to. There are two questions. This precision, the level of precision in these entries. I mean, what about the precision of these entries? I mean, one is why did the librarians or the catalogers need to designate these volumes with much precision as possible? And the easy answer to this question is about the lending function of this library. And there were certain concerns about the loss of the items. I mean, there is this famous story about the librarian of Mehmet II in the late 15th century, who replaced certain glorious items with cheap ones and sold those items in the market, and he was charged with book theft. So book theft and the loss of items was a pretty common thing for the lending libraries at the time. So in order to kind of prevent that to happen, that kind of precision in the entries and the regular inspection of the volumes in every decade or in every 30 years maybe was required. And as I mentioned a lot during my talk, that precision is of course invaluable for us, the 21st century scholars, just to penetrate into the textual, intellectual, and material universe of these instructors and students. And on that note, I'll just conclude my talk. Thank you.
Let me just share my screen. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. First, thanks, Brink and the Center for the invitation and for pairing us together. I think that this idea generated a really interesting conversation that we wouldn't have had otherwise. And I hope, and I think it will continue elsewhere. We even came up with this idea of Ottoman metadata that I think it's a newly coined concept. I'm personally excited, and I'm very excited to be to participate in this series, in part because I've been interested in the Khalidiyya for almost 2 decades now. I was fortunate enough to visit the library almost a decade ago and consult a few manuscripts. I was, and I still am, grateful for the generosity and the hospitality of the library and the family. I see that Khadir Salam is on this call. I've read his catalog of the Khalidiyya numerous times, cover to cover, and I'm very excited that he's that he's here. I'll join the previous praises that many people sung to the Himmel for making this collection and many others available to the world. I think that this series shows how important these digitization projects are in generating new conversations that otherwise we wouldn't have had. And finally, I would like to acknowledge my intellectual debt in this project to the work of Yavuz Sezer, who passed away earlier this year of COVID. Yavuz's work on the rise of a specific type of Ottoman library in the 17th and the 18th century has been incredibly important to me in this project. Yavuz passed away as I was reading the inventory, and his work has been incredibly, truly indispensable. And I would like to dedicate this presentation to his memory. I want to say a few words about the library of Ahmad Pasha al-Jazzar, a library that is closer to the Khalidiyya, both chronologically and geographically located in the northern Palestinian town of Akka, or Acre in English. I think that al-Jazzar is one of the very few Ottoman provincial governors that need little introduction. I think is one of the best known governors, not just in Palestinian history, but in the history of the empire in general, to a large extent, thanks to his successful defense of the city against the Napoleonic troops, but also because of his reputation as a cruel and ambitious governor, and also for his construction projects that he undertook in the city, construction projects that to a large extent reflect his ambition. One of these projects is the mosque complex that he built in the city. The complex is in conversation or mirrors similar complexes that we have in the core of the empire and in the Ottoman capital. Is unique in Palestine in terms of the architecture and the architectural idiom, less so in greater Bilad Hashem, but in the context of Palestine, very unique. It consists of the mosque, the tomb of the governor, the city's Qadi court, the madrasa, and the library that, much like the library that Tunç and Abdurrahman are studying, was intended to serve the madrasa, but it was also intended to serve the public good, at least that's how it is framed in several sources. Al-Jazzar called the mosque or the complex An-Nur al-Ahmadi, and I think that it's in clear reference to the first major Sultanic mosque complex of the 18th century, the Nur Osmaniye mosque in Istanbul. The name itself is quite unusual for a provincial mosque, and that says a lot about the ambition and the way that Al-Jazzar understood his mission. And I would try to convince you that this ambition is also reflected in his library. Until recently, most of what was known about the library came from three types of sources, or three sources. The first is the endowment deed, where Al-Jazzar sort of lays out the general plan of what he wanted to do. There we learned that he stipulated the position of the librarian. Then we have a very interesting account that Volney includes in his travelogue. Volney visited Akka towards the mid 1780s. He visited the city, but did not see the library. But he says three interesting things about the library. First, he says that it's one of two noteworthy libraries in Syria, and otherwise a deplorable library scene. This is not accurate. He then says that the library held something like 300 manuscripts. That may or may not be true. And he also says that the library held the collection of Khairi, the Mufti of Ramle, probably Khairuddin Ramli or one of his descendants. That may or may not be true. It is interesting, though. The account is interesting because it conveys the sense of, first, of al-Jazzar's ambition and the kind of project that he wanted to do. And it really became one of the famous libraries that to this day still have this phantom presence in the history of libraries, not just in Palestine and Bilad al-Sham, but in the empire more generally. And it has already been mentioned in this series by at least two speakers. Then we have the manuscripts that, the known manuscripts that were part of this library. I know that Garrett Davidson is in the process of identifying more manuscripts. At this point, Garrett has identified something like 35 or 40 manuscripts. The best known manuscript that came from this library is this 10th century copy of the catalog or the Fihrist of Ibn al-Nadim. It was copied in Iraq or Baghdad in the late 10th century. It is famous. It was owned by the famous Mamluk era scholar al-Makrizi, and then ended up at the Library of al-Jazzar. And then in the late 1920s, it was removed from the mosque, from the library by Abraham Shalom Yehuda and sold to Chester Beatty. Again, when Garrett found the exchange between Abraham Shalom Yehuda and Chester Beatty about the removal of this manuscript, and probably many others from the mosque. Then several manuscripts from this library also found their way to North American libraries. 5 or 6 manuscripts from the library are now at Princeton, and three of them are now digitized and available to the world. And I would like to thank Deborah Schlein, my colleague at Princeton, and the librarians and the staff at the special collections who digitized these manuscripts for me and the world during the pandemic, that made the research on this project much easier. A few years ago, my friend and colleague Nada Mumtaz was working in Ankara on her research, and she came across this inventory of the holdings of the library of Ahmad Pasha al-Jazzar. It is bound with the Waqfiyya as not pretty similar to the layout of the inventories that Tunç just showed us. It follows the layout of the Ottoman administrative register, or the defter. It is interesting, and this is sort of like a parenthetical comment, that the same layout was also employed by whoever made one of the first and the earliest inventories of the Khalidiyya on the left. It's an inventory of the books donated to the Khalidiyya by Sheikh Muhammad Sunallah, and there are interesting continuities that we may want to say a few words about them in the Q&A. In any case, this inventory is interesting for numerous reasons, and I think that it adds a completely new layer to what we learn about the library from the previous sources I just mentioned. First, it was compiled in 1801, that is 20 years or so after Volney's visit to the Akka, and towards the end of al-Jazzar's life. And it's the first time that we have a sense of what was there, and I think it justifies the phantom presence of this library. So it's a collection. The core collection of the library consisted of 300 volumes, mostly manuscripts, but there are a few printed books, mostly in Arabic, but there are also books in Persian and Turkish. This scope and the linguistic representation reflects the ambition of al-Jazzar and his attempt to build an imperial and a library that would be an imperial library at scope. Most libraries from the most of the libraries that were founded in the late 17th to and throughout the 18th century held anything between 1,500 to 2,000 volumes. So 1,600 volumes is significant. The Hamidiyya library that was founded by the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid I several decades earlier held something like 1,500 volumes. So it is a very significant library. In addition to the core collection, there are 3 libraries that were incorporated into this, the library, and they are listed in separate sections. And this is why this document is extremely important for the study of smaller, lesser known libraries in Palestine and Bilad al-Sham. One was the library of a small and a very interesting library from Jaffa, held by a scholar, a member of the Tibi family. And in terms of coverage, again, there was a clear attempt to coverage all the major Islamic fields and disciplines. There are the constellation of sciences in some cases may seem somewhat unusual. For instance, the decision to group together the books dealing with tasawwuf and theology or tawheed in the same section, that may be a bit unusual, or to include devotional text in the section of hadith, not unusual, not unheard of, but not that common. But otherwise, there is an attempt to cover most fields of knowledge. The classification is also quite similar to classification that we find in other Syrian and Shami libraries, like the library of Ahmad Pasha al-Duriki that was studied and published recently by Saeed al-Jumani, who I also think is on this call. But what I think, or what was most exciting for me about this inventory is the librarian. The inventory is signed by one Suleyman Effendi, who identifies himself as the librarian, or Nazir al-Kutubkhane, or Nazir al-Kutubkhane uses the Turkish Izafet structure. I don't know much. I don't know anything about Suleyman Effendi other than what I can learn about him from the inventory. He was clearly an alim or learned, hence the title Effendi. The way that he uses the title may suggest that he came from the Turkish-speaking parts of the empire, but maybe not. We may learn about him more as we look at additional manuscripts, but at this point, most of what we know about him comes from this inventory. He is not listed in any of the biographical dictionaries of the 17th and of the 18th century. One of the things that is very unusual, maybe not extremely unusual, but quite unusual, is his attention to details. And I think that those who attend this panel may have the impression that this is a common practice, but I think it is important to stress that it's actually quite rare what Tunç found and this inventory. This is not very, very common. he's interested in the, so for every entry, Suleiman Effendi would list the title of the book, the calligraphic script, the format, the illumination and the illustration, the ruling or the charts, and the type of binding. If it's a multi-part, you will list the number of volumes. If there are missing pages, it will list this as well. I don't have much time, and I'll just look. I was particularly interested in his interest in scripts, and here is very, or I think is quite unusual. I might be wrong about that, but I think is quite unusual. In the gallery of scripts that he applies in his description, he uses, or he mentions, something between 16 to 17 types of 16 or 17 scripts. Some are very conventional, like Nas or Talik, but then there are many scripts like the Egyptian script or the Istanbul script or the Maghrebi script that are less commonly used or commonly known. They are not listed, for instance, in calligraphic manuals or manuals about calligraphy from the Ottoman lands, but also in Western languages. So it may not be idiosyncratic, and there might be many other librarians in the circles of Suleiman Effendi that may have understood what he meant by those. But for me, these were quite unusual. Now, what makes this gallery extremely interesting, and what makes the inventory more broadly so interesting to me, is that many of these manuscripts ended up in European and American institutions and were cataloged by American and European catalogers. And then we have a rare opportunity to compare notes. And I would like to stress that the point here is not to say who got it right, at least not at this point. I think that what is interesting is just to see that how Suleiman Effendi and the cataloger, in this case in the Chester Beatty, interpreted the same manuscript. So the cataloger of the Chester Beatty, when he cataloged this manuscript, thought that, or decided to, or designated Nas as the script for this manuscript, whereas Suleiman Effendi says that it was written in the Egyptian script, or Khat Misri. It's not fully clear to me how systematically Suleiman Effendi applied these categories across the inventory, and we may learn about it as we see more manuscripts. But I think that what is interesting is, before we get to the question of who got it right, is to entertain the possibility that we can expand the vocabulary and our descriptive practices. And I think it's a really rare opportunity that to have different bibliographic traditions and different descriptive practices intersect in or around concrete manuscripts. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Muted as usual. I worry about Amsterdam Avenue all the time. It's so noisy. Anyway, thank you both. I mean, very, very impressive stuff. And there are many connections, it looks like, between the two, the imperial level and the more local provincial level. And so people who would like to ask a question, please do so, pose it or in the Q&A. And we'll come to that when those come. So I'm sort of curious about the overall terminology of these, keeping these these references and these descriptions of text. Is Behrest, does that handle it? No. Okay. So what
in my case, the word used is defter, the register. I mean, it's a pretty Ottoman bureaucratic tradition, and I think it echoes well with Guy's references to that Ottoman bookkeeping and bureaucratic conventions. So the word they use is defter in general.
Wow, okay.
In my case, I should say.
And it also seems that we have them because they were part of the administrative responsibility. So it was part of, it's really bookkeeping more than cataloging.
But it's also sort of a recognition of significance. You know, you don't catalog stuff of no significance. These are all books, right? Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about it's like a tarajim of codices, you know, as opposed to, it's like the biographical dictionary version of how you handle books. And because the authors are always there too, the central feature. It's like part of many lives is the books they authored, and so it has humans in it too. It's not just paper books. Mm-hmm. So anyway, but so you to agree that the deftar mode is the mode of compilation and the mode of documentation and inventorying. Very interesting. I had a question that came sort of early, actually, because Tunç was talking about patrons and lending. And I'm wondering how that works, because these are Waqf books. They're in a collection. And then also you have these libraries being connected with madrasas. And the students are wanting these texts. But that's probably involves the work of copying. Mm-hmm. And but do students make any mark in the book, in the text after they copy their own copy, or the student copy very sort of?
Well, I think this question could be answered more elaborately when we will trace those physical surviving copies and browse their contents. I mean, this is the most exciting part as far as I'm concerned, actually, with this project that Abdurrahman and I are conducting. I mean, if we can look closely those physical folios that once the mudarrises or the students actually held and studied, maybe we'll come across really interesting traces of use or discussions in a teaching session or in a copying, etc., etc. I mean, this is the pretty early stages of the research, I should say. So we weren't able to examine the surviving copies in detail yet. But I'm hoping that we'll be able to come up with such anecdotal information through notes about the copying stages of these texts, etc. Yeah,
they do note if it's an autograph copy, mm-hmm. Then that's noted, right?
Yeah, usually yes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. But, you know, I worked a little bit on the Imam's library in 20th century Yemen, and they were very careful about letting the books out of the room even. People could take them out into the mosque and look at them. They couldn't take them away, mm-hmm. You know, that kind of thing. But copying was really what the story was. It was about making your own copy for study, just like you're sitting in the lesson circle, huh?
Mm-hmm. Al-Jazzar is very clear that at least the endowment says that the book should not leave the library. And we know we know they ended up leaving the library eventually, because that's how they ended up in various libraries, including the Khalidiyya. But at least the idea was that they should be read in the library.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then maybe also copied in the library. Who knows? Anyway, we have some questions for you. Muhammad Salman Ansari asks, how relevant do the speakers find the Ottoman categories for the present content? Present context, maybe? Can they be used to catalog the literature produced in the Islamic world today?
I would say absolutely. I think that one of the interesting things, and I think this is why I think one of the things that is really interesting about Ottoman metadata is that so many of the manuscripts that we have in the world passed through these lands, even if they were not Ottoman manuscripts per se. And I think that many of these librarians can actually situate many of these books in contexts that are simply lost to 21st readers, to 21st century readers, not just to Westerners, but to many people, even in who claim to be working in these traditions. And I think that many of these people just can offer us interesting clues about sensibilities, about context, constellations of sciences that we may not. And I think that that's something that we both learned when we did the Treasures of Knowledge, that how little we know, actually.
I mean, I forgot to mention during my presentation, but the inventory is divided into different clusters, and each cluster refers to a particular knowledge category. And it tells you how the knowledge is hierarchized in the eyes of these Ottoman librarians / catalogers. So it starts with the Quran commentary, and it all the way goes down through hadith and legal theory and substantive law and theology and philosophy. So you can have a clear picture of how knowledge is classified, or how the classification schemes of knowledge were adopted by some indigenous Ottoman scholars here.
Okay, here's another one from Pier Mattia Tomasino, who's here at Columbia in the Italian department and who works on the translation of the Quran. Did early modern librarians across the Ottoman Empire copy and share catalogs and inventories? European librarians of the time shared lists of manuscripts in Arabic script across Europe. I don't know exactly.
In the case of the Fatih Mosque library catalog, the new librarians had access to the earlier inventories, but only to the inventories of that particular complex. I'm not so sure whether they had access to other library catalogs available in Istanbul or other parts of the empire. Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, we have these, for instance, the inventory of Bayezid found its way to Budapest, and we don't really know. I mean, no one really knows how it ended up there. So there may be more. These things may have circulated, and we know that this inventory found its way to Ankara. So there may have been circulation of these documents for bureaucratic purposes as part of the inspection of endowments, and not so much for the same reasons that humanists share these records.
So here's a related question. Were inventories, this is from Scott Elwood, were inventories themselves collected outside the library that produced them? Dr. Burak discussed a Fihrist included in one inventory, but were these considered the same genre as a deftar, compiled for the same purpose and use?
So the Fihrist is very different. The Fihrist is there is the genre and the tradition that is not as common. I mean, there is common, but there are not that many works in this tradition that were compiled. These bibliographies like Khatib Chelebi's Kashf al-Zunun and others, but these are different types of works that follow different conventions. They are not completely unrelated, but these are not exactly the same type of documents.
And what I mean by inventory or catalog is different than the list of books one could find in an endowment deed. I mean, they are not exactly the same. I mean, what I mean by the inventory or a catalog is an individual separate textual unit, not part of the waqfiyya, the endowment. So it has its own textual history and biography. But to what extent we could trace its travel, it's a difficult issue.
So here I have a question from Shuaib Ali. Dear Dr. Tunç, do we know why manuscripts were sent to these madrasas like Fateh instead of copies being made? It seems like valuable, unique copies were being moved out of the palace collection and ended up in less prestigious collections like Fazil Ahmed.
Well, one of the points I was trying to make in the article, Study Islamic article, you mentioned, is this common practice of sending set of books from the court, from the palace, to different places, including the madrasas or the chief physician's office or the observatory established in the late 16th century. So there's a standard practice adopted by the Ottoman court, sending extra copies of text available in the court library to places where these copies were needed. So the copies were sent not to be copied, but just to be stayed there for a long time. So we have numerous bureaucratic registers listing all those items shipped from the palace to different places, including the madrasas or other venues.
Okay, Ali Rafe asks about, thanks Burak for the presentation. And just a small question, he says, about the list of scripts which you've examined statistically. Ta'aliq is a specific type of script in medieval and modern Persia, mostly attributed to the administrative style of script used for insha related texts such as documents, letters, etc. I know that in Mughal India, as well as in Ottoman lands, this ta'liq is mostly attributed to the script that is mostly called in Persia nastaliq, or the tahriri and non-calligraphic style of it. But could you explain more about the term ta'liq Turki, which maybe I made that sound like Italian or something, which is named in your examination?
I don't know. I mean, that's part of the issue, part of the challenge is that we don't really know what he meant, because we don't know what we haven't seen the physical manuscript in some cases, and as more and more manuscripts come to light, we may be able to have a better sense of what Süleyman Efendi had in mind when he applied these terms. But I think it is interesting to know that someone somewhere made this distinction, and that there were subcategories within the ta'liq that we, or the nastaliq that we find in calligraphic manuals.
We have a question from Dotan Halabi. I'm very curious to hear more about the cannibalization of small libraries by the bigger ones, which Guy mentioned. How is this evident in the registers? For Tunç Hocam, is there a similar phenomenon in the faith or other libraries in the Fateh or other libraries in the Imperial Center?
So in the inventory, so there were 3 sub-libraries that are listed in separate sections, and they are described as ma'khudha, that like can be, it's hard to because it's not really a legal term, or at least as far as I'm, so it can be confiscated, it can be just incorporated into the collection, but they are kept, there are other cases, because we know that some of the manuscripts were owned by other people, and then they were dispersed and or classified within the core collection. These 3, for reasons that I don't know, were kept as integral or as separate sections. But and I think that in other inventories, again, like the one studied by Said Al-Jumani. So later donations were added on top of the core collection. So it's unclear to me, and maybe Said is on this call can say why certain manuscripts were incorporated into the core collection and why others were kept as separate as separate sub collections.
Okay.
I don't have a concrete example about the cannibalization of smaller collections, but for instance, the 1561 inventory has 500 more books listed than the earlier catalog. And most of these new items came from one particular Ottoman scholar in the 16th century. So he donated out of his generosity, I assume, to the mosque complex. I mean, it wasn't cannibalized, I believe, but we don't really know the full mechanisms of book donation by people to larger complexes. I mean, how did it really take place? The inventories do not give any particular clue about it.
Okay, here's a question from our colleague Wael Halak. Do we know which fields of knowledge, fiqh, tasawwuf, tawhid, falsafa, etc., commanded the largest numbers of books in these libraries? Is there a rough idea of numerical ordering by subject? I thought that Guy's diagram sort of did some of that. I mean, maybe we couldn't see all the categories, but it had a lot of categories already in your paper's diagram, right?
I would say, though, that the categories are not completely misleading, but obviously the core texts are stable, but then there are other texts that may be classified in different libraries in different sections. So I would take the numbers with a grain of salt. But we do. I think the inventories allow us to say what were the main sections, or the largest sections.
I mean, I saw sort of Quran stuff. I saw Hadith stuff. I saw Tib. I saw Tasawwuf. I mean, it was a lot there. I mean,
book is the most important, I should say. I mean, it's a normative category, of course, but almost 40% of the entire collection consists of fiqh books, including legal theory and substantive law. We have more than 400 out of 1100 actually were fiqh books, which is not surprising, of course, just because it was a madrasa collection. But astronomy, for instance, I'm particularly interested in that. It's pretty marginalized. It doesn't have any cluster at all, and there are only a few items on astronomy or medicine that you can find in these madrasa inventories.
So here's a question from Aisha Noor Elf Unal. Many thanks for the great presentations. There were some Masahif Sharifa according to Suleiman Effendi's classification. Do you have any information about these Quranic manuscripts? Are they currently available in a library?
I don't know. Maybe somewhere. But the thing is that the problem in this kind of research, and I think Boris pointed it out in his presentation, is that typically most of our catalogs don't capture ownership notes and seals, and these are the kind of things that it is very likely that many of these manuscripts are available or that have survived and are somewhere. But until someone goes through collections and identify these books, it's very rare. The reason why the manuscripts that we have are visible is because Yehuda, at least many of them, Yehuda was involved in removing them from the mosque and selling them, and this is why we know that they came from the mosque. Others require the work of people like Boris to just go through collections and find the seals, or the work that Tunç and Abdurrahman are doing in the Suleymaniya. So
here's a question from Kanita Beshevich. Is there a common catalog of the Ottoman manuscripts that also incorporates all items worldwide? Are the collections digitized?
There is this website called yazmalar.org that has that kind of ambition to inventorize all Ottoman manuscripts, but it fails for a number of purposes, I should say. Many items in Süleymaniye, I mean, not many, almost all of the items at Süleymaniye were digitized and available only when you visit the library in person, or you can also contact via email if you know the catalog number of the item you're interested in. You can fill out a form and they send you the manuscript via email. But unfortunately, there is no such thing as the BNF collection that you can easily find the digital copies and download them.
Laura Goffman asks Dr. Burak, building on your final point comparing Euro and Ottoman classifications, I wonder if you would mind reflecting on how your own work as a librarian has influenced how you navigate and conceptualize this material, how you frame research questions, and what you see as the possible impact of this research.
That's a good question. I would say that, yeah, so I am interested in metadata because I create metadata, and I am interested in classifications. But I do think that there is something that I do think that there is something in general, when people look at inventories, for the most part, there is a tendency to look at these inventories or the documents as sort of mimetic representations of the library, and people go straight to the shelf or to the manuscript. And I think that sometimes when you have visible librarians like Fenadi or Atufi or Suleiman Effendi, suddenly this intellectual work is more visible, and suddenly we see context, and we see much more than just books, a list of books on real or imaginary or mimetic shelves.
Tunç, you want to get in on that one? Because you work with manuscript collections in the Columbia Library.
True, but you know, I don't have much to add to what Guy has already said as a librarian, because I don't really have that sort of experience as a librarian, so I don't have that kind of eyes, I should say.
So maybe we should leave it at that. It's very wonderful. I mean, it's incredible work. And to think about collections of books is just fantastic. And what should we call them, books or codices? I mean, I don't know.
I should just say before we leave that if someone is interested in taking a look at the register, please reach out. I'd be happy to share. I think that it's a document that more people have to see and look at. I think that one of the things that we've learned from all these projects is that these things lend themselves to collaborations. So I cannot post them online because of restrictions from the Turkish archives, but feel free to reach out. Whoever watches this video, I'd be happy to share this register.
Great, great. Thanks very much. By the way, I want to thank Simone for helping to organize this event today. And as she noted, you can catch up on the previous sessions of the readings in the Khalidiyya, all last year's and the first one this semester, on the website. And you know, you just look under Jerusalem and under Khalidiyya, and you'll see where these other previous encounters have been taped and are available. Anyway, thank you both, Tunç and Guy. Very interesting presentations and stimulated a lot of questions.
Wonderful questions, yeah.
Huh?
Thanks for all the wonderful questions.
Yeah, you know, the questions are still coming, and we really shouldn't, I don't think we really have time to answer them all. But anyway, thanks so much. And thanks to the audience for joining us. and we'll see you next time.